Daf Yomi, Daf Yomi, Daf Yomi, Daf Yomi, Daf Yomi. Menachot, page 11. Daf Yud Aleph. And we're starting from the bottom of Yud Amud Beis for context. The Mishnah teaches if a priest removed the handful of flour and a stone or a grain of salt emerged in his hand. Now we turn to top of Menachot 11, top of the page with the words O Koret Levona. O Koret Levona Pasul Kol Hani Labali, or a pinch of frankincense emerged in his hand. The meal offering is unfit, as the handful lacks a full measure on account of these items. It has to be complete full, not even the slightest, smallest speck of anything can infringe upon the fullness of what is in his hand, for holding this mincha offering. As the handful lacks a full measure on account of these items. The Gemara asks, why do I need all these examples? Any one of them would convey the fact that the handful must contain a full measure. So, just say anything that's in your hand. Why do you have to say, or a stone, or a pinch of, or salt? Okay. Tzaricha, it is necessary. The Gemara explains all of the cases are necessary, because if the Mishnah had taught only the example of a stone, it might have been thought that only a stone diminishes the measure of the handful because it is not fit for sacrifice. With regard to salt, which is fit for sacrifice, as the priest places salt on the handful before burning it upon the altar. Just thinking about it myself, it's a really big Chadash. I mean, there's going to be salt in it anyway. So why can't you just start now? No. It has to, every time is something. That's a good Dvar Torah. The Mishnah teaches that even if a little bit of salt, but you're going to put salt on it anyway. What's wrong if it's done now? No. Every time is something new. When we're here right now, we can't do that thing. When we get there, then you can do it. But not before. Like that. As the priest places salt in the handful before burning it upon the altar, one might say that the handful should be fit, as the salt should not subtract from the handful's measure. That's a good Dvar Torah. I like it. Okay, anyway, v'yitzan ha-melech lo ikva b'hadi mincha mi'ikare she'eino melech ela b'komet b'vad אבל לבוא אין ikva b'hadi mincha mi'ikare eimot titkashar kol mashpelam. And if the Mishnah taught only the example of salt, it might have been thought that the salt diminishes the handful's measure as it was not initially fixed together with the entire meal offering. The reason is that the priest salts the handful alone. But with regard to the frankincense, which was initially fixed together with the meal offering, meaning it is placed upon the meal offering before the priest removes the handful from it, one might say the handful should be fit and the frankincense should not diminish from the handful's measure. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches that in any of these instances, the meal offering is unfit. The Mishnah teaches that if a stone or a grain of salt or a pinch of frankincense emerged in the priest's hand together with the handful, the meal offering is unfit due to the fact that the sages said the handful that is lacking or that is outside is unfit. The the Gemara asks, why does the Tana explain that the offering is not valid specifically because it is lacking or outsized? But let the Tana derive that such a handful is not valid due to the fact that there is an interposition between the priest's hand and the handful. Rabbi Jeremiah says, since there are certain instances where these items do not interpose between one's hand and the handful, for example, when they are located on the side of the handful, the Mishnah teaches that they disqualify the handful due to the fact that they reduce its measure. Ketzat komtzin amarle kidekamtzin chi etve zo zeret zo kamitza. Abaye said to Rava, how do the priests properly remove the handful from a meal offering? Rava said to him, they remove it as people normally remove handfuls by folding all of their fingers over the palm of the hand. Abaye raised an objection to Rava. From a bride discussing the mitzvah function of each of the fingers, this small finger is for measuring a span, see Exodus 28:16, meaning the distance between the thumb and the little finger. This fourth finger is used for removal of a handful from the meal offering, meaning the measurement of a handful begins from this finger as the priest removes the handful by folding the middle three fingers over his palm. Zo ama zo etzba zo godel. Etzba. Ama etzba and godel. Right. Zeret. Ama, etzba. Furthermore, this middle finger is used for measuring a cubit, the distance from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. This forefinger next to the thumb is the finger used to sprinkle the blood of offerings on the altar. And finally, this thumb is the one on which the blood and oil is placed during the purification of a leper. See Leviticus 14:17. Evidently, the little finger is not used in the removal of a handful. The Gemara responds, the little finger is used only for the purposes of leveling a handful. That is to say, the priest removes a handful with a full hand, meaning all his fingers so that it should be not lacking in measure, and then he wipes away the protruding flour with his little finger from the bottom, with his thumb from the top. The Gemara comments. The Gemara asks, how is the removal of the handful performed? Rav Zutra Bar Tovia says, then Rav says, when the priest places his hand in the meal offering, he bends his middle three fingers, until the tips of his fingers reach over the palm of his hand. And he then removes the handful, The Gemara notes that this also is taught in the Braita. From the verse that states, and he shall remove from there his handful, Leviticus 2:2, one might have thought that the handful should be overflowing. Therefore, another verse states, and he shall take up from it with his handful, Bekumtso. Leviticus 6:8. The prefix that means with can also mean in, indicating that the proper measure of a handful is that which is contained within one's fingers alone. Bekumtso. The Braita continues, if the measurement of a handful is determined by the term was with his handful. One might have thought that the priest removes a handful with his fingertips. In other words, that a handful consists of that which the priest removes by folding his fingers onto themselves. Therefore, the verse states his handful, indicating that the handful must be full, and not merely that which is contained within his fingers. How so? He scoops by closing his 3 fingers over the palm of his hand, and in this way takes a handful from the flour of the meal offering. B'machavat uve'marcheshet mochek begudalo milmala uve'etzba'o ketana milmata v'zohi avoda kasha sheba mikdash. The Braita continues, in the case of a pan meal offering and that of a deep pan meal offering, when the flour was fried before being scooped and was therefore hard, the priest wipes away with his thumb any flour that was overflowing above his handful, and with his little finger he wipes away the flour that was pushing out below. And this precise taking of a handful of a meal offering is the most difficult sacrificial rite in the temple, as the priest must wipe away any protruding elements without removing any flour from the handful itself. Zehu v'tula v'ikamalika v'ikachamvina v'zohi achat me'avodot kashot shemikdash. The Gemara is asking, it's a technical point, it's asking, is this really the hardest thing? The Gemara asks, this one is the hardest sacrificial rite and no other. But isn't there pinching the nape of the neck of a bird offering, which is also considered extremely difficult to perform? And isn't there a scooping of the handful of incense by the high priest on Yom Kippur, another rite that is extremely difficult to perform? Rather, the Braita means this taking of the handful of the meal offering is one of the most difficult sacrificial rites in the temple. Even though it didn't say that, but it said this is the most difficult. But it really means it's not the most difficult. It's one of the most difficult. Okay? It's from the most difficult. Should have said that. I don't think they were lacking words. I think they could have said that. Anyway. Amarav Papa Pshitali Melokum So Kidekamtsi Inashi by Rav Papa Kamas Barashes Piotav Mai. Rav Papa said, it is obvious to me that the term his handful means that the removal of the handful of a meal offering should be performed ab initio in the manner that people usually remove a handful, with their fingertips angled to the side. Rav Papa raises a dilemma. What is the halacha if the priest removed a handful with his fingertips? In other words, if he placed his hand horizontally over the meal offering and filled his palm with flour by closing his fingers to his palm. I think like this, right? Like that. Does this qualify as taking the handful or not? Miatzdadin mai, mimata lemala mai, teku. Similarly, if the priest took a handful from the sides by passing the back of his hand, and fourth, over the flour in the vessel, so that the flour collected in his palm by way of the side of his palm. Okay, what are we saying here? Similarly, if the priest took a handful from the sides by passing the back of his hand back and forth over the flour in the vessel, so that the flour collected in his palm by way of the side of his palm. I'm not sure what that means, but okay. What's the halacha? Furthermore, if he took the handful with the back of his hand placed downward in the vessel, and with his fingers he collected the flour upward into his palm. Oh, maybe put like under that. Okay. What's the halacha? Are these handfuls removed in this manner fit for a sacrifice? The Gemara states, teku. To all these, we don't know. We don't know the answer. We must wait till Elijah the prophet comes to herald the coming of the Messiah, maybe soon in our day. This would be the 230th teku, keeping count, according to the book by Rabbi Pessin. Another teku comes from Rav Papa. Have you noticed that Rav Papa asks a lot of tekus? I think out of all the tekus, Rav Papa is definitely up there with one of the most. Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rav Papa, those two names, I see them so prevalent when it comes to asking tekus. Of course, you have others here and there, Rav Ashi here, and but basically, if you're only Bar Chama, possibly. I'm thinking like Rav Papa definitely takes the cake for the amount of. Seems to me like it would be the most. But anyway, what's interesting is that Rav Papa asked the very first teku, and Rav Papa is mentioned at a siyum. So there's some clues here. I'm trying to just go down this rabbit hole. If there's some secret codes in the Talmud, and they're placed there in such a way that it looks like everything looks like matter of fact and just as normal. But if you do a certain amount of gematrias and a certain amount of counting and paying attention to things, you'll notice some interesting things. For example, very interesting that the tradition is that when the Messiah comes, our tekus will be answered, right? And the one who asks the very first teku in the Shas, it's in Tractate Brachot, page 8a, at the bottom of the page, about 2 lines from the bottom, is Rav Papa. But the gematria of Rav Papa is 363, which equals HaMashiach. So how interesting is that the very first teku, and now what I'm noticing is that maybe most of the tekus are asked by Rav Papa, and his name equals the Messiah. I get a kick out of that. Anyway, Amar Rav Papa Pshitali Menachot Navkide Chafni Nashi by Rav Papa Chafan Brashis Potav Mahu Miat Dodin Mahu Chafan Zubazo Uzo Bekirvan Zoe Zilzo Mahu Teku. Rav Papa said, it's obvious to me that when the Torah states his handful, Leviticus 16:12, in the context of the scooping of handfuls of incense by the high priest on Yom Kippur, it means in the manner that people usually scoop a handful by placing the backs of their hands into the vessel and bringing their hands together. Rav Papa raises a dilemma. Rav Papa again. What is the halacha if the high priest scooped a handful with his fingertips? What is the halacha if he took a handful from the sides? What is the halacha if he scooped a handful with his hand, with this hand, and with that hand separately, and brought them together? All these alternate ways of scooping and gathering a handful. And to this, the Gemara states, teku. We don't know. These dilemmas shall stand unresolved. Boy, Rav Papa, yet another one, the 232nd teku. Boy, Rav Papa, dabke lekometz bedafne dimanamai tochli beinan v'aika odilma anacha betocho beinan v'leka teku. Rav Papa raises yet another dilemma. If the priest took a handful from the vessel containing the meal offering and stuck the handful onto the side of the second vessel in order to sanctify it. In other words, the handful was not placed directly into the vessel. What is the halacha? Do we require that the handful be inside the vessel? And that is the case here. Or perhaps we require that the handful must be placed properly inside the vessel. And that is not the case in this instance. No answer is found. The Gemara concludes again, Teku, the dilemma shall stand unresolved as the coming of Simon and David. And now, a final Teku, but it's not asked by Republic, by Ravashi, by Mar Baravashi. By Mar Baravashi, Hav Chelamana, Vidab Kele Kometz, Be'ariyata Dimana, Mai, Anach Betocha Be'enan, Ve'aika Odilma Ke Tikno Be'enan Veleka Teku. Where Mar Baravashi raises the final dilemma for now, which would be the 233rd Teku in the Babylonian Talmud. Mar Baravashi raises a similar dilemma. If the priest overturned the vessel and stuck the handful to the underside of the vessel, in a case where there was an indentation in the underside, what's the halacha? Do we require that the handful be placed inside the vessel? And that requirement is fulfilled here, as the handful is within the indentation. Or perhaps we require that it be placed properly in the vessel, and that is not the case here. The Gemara states, again, the dilemma shall stand and resolve Teku Tishbi Taras Kashios Vivoyos. And now for the new Mishnah. Keitzadois Mishnah. Keitzadois Poshet is Poshet al Bas Yado. How does the priest perform the removal of a handful? He extends his fingers onto the palm of his hand. If one increases oil, decreases oil, or decreases frankincense beyond the appropriate measures, the meal offering is unfit. That's the Mishnah, folks. Now the Talmud Zog, the Halakha Talmud. Hechidami riba shmana amar Eliezer kigon shehifrish la shnei nugin velokma kigon diareba shemen dechulin v'shemen dechaverta. What are the circumstances of a case where the meal offering is disqualified due to the fact that one increases its oil? Rabbi Eliezer says the circumstances are a case where he separated 2 logs of oil for the meal offering instead of 1 log, and mixed them into 1/10 of an ephah of flour. The Gemara raises a difficulty and let Rabbi Eliezer interpret the Mishnah as referring to a case where he mixed non-sacred oil or the oil of another meal offering into the meal offering. La Pesal. Weiter, where were we? Let's start the Gemara over again. Why not? The Gemara says, what are the circumstances of a case where the meal offering is disqualified due to the fact that one increases oil? Rabbi Eliezer says the circumstances are the case where he separated 2 logs of oil for the meal offering instead of 1 log and mixed them into 1/10 of ephah of flour. The Gemara raises difficulty and let Rabbi Eliezer interpret the Mishnah as referring to a case where he mixed non-sacred oil or the oil of another meal offering into the meal offering. And if you would say that non-sacred oil and the oil of another meal offering do not disqualify a meal offering, Razucha Bartovia objects to this claim. If that is so, then with regard to the meal offering of a sinner, of which it is stated in 59b that oil disqualifies it, how can you find the circumstances where it is in fact disqualified? Idida halesla idechulin v'dechaverta amato posel yamr de'afish l'shemen kim d'ales l'shemen klal l'chulin minu. Rav Zucher Bartovi elaborates, if you suggest that he mixed its own oil into the flour, such a case does not exist, as the meal offering of a sinner does not have any oil. If he mixed non-sticking oil, or that of another meal offering into the flour, the meal offering should not be disqualified. As you said that such oil does not disqualify a meal offering. And if you would say that he designated oil for his meal offering and mixed it into the flour despite the Torah prohibition against mixing oil into it, I say that since the meal offering of a sinner does not have oil at all, any oil that he separates and mixes into it is considered non-sacred. And you have already said that non-sacred oil does not disqualify a meal offering. The Gemara responds, in fact, non-sacred oil and the oil of another meal offering do disqualify a meal offering. And Rabbi Eliezer is speaking, utilizing the style of it is not necessary as follows. It is not necessary to say that non-sacred oil and the oil of another meal offering disqualify a meal offering. But in a case where one separated 2 log for his meal offering, since this first log is fit for the meal offering, and that second log is also fit for it, one might say that even when he mixes both log into the meal offering, it should not disqualify the meal offering. Therefore, Rabbi Eliezer teaches us that the meal offering is disqualified in this case as well. מה ירידת הנריבה שמנה ליסני ריבה לשמן אלא הקמשמם תאף על גב דהיבריש לה שני לוגים. The Gemara asks, and from where does Rabbi Eliezer derive this conclusion? Rabbi said the terminology of the Mishnah posed a difficulty for him, as one can ask, why does the Tana specifically teach that the meal offering is disqualified if he increased its oil, which indicates that he increased it with oil belonging to the offering itself? Let the Mishnah teach simply, he increased the oil. Rather, this is what the Mishnah teaches us, that even though he initially separated 2 log of oil for the meal offering, its own oil disqualifies the offering. When there is too much, chisev levonata tanu rabanan chas Rabbi Yamna koret echad pesula shne koratin כשרה דברי רבי יהודה רבי שמעון אומר אל כורת אחד כשרה פחות מכאן בסולם. The Mishnah teaches that if one decreased its frankincense beyond its appropriate measure, the meal offering is unfit. Concerning this, the sages taught in a Braita, if one decreased its frankincense to the point that the amount stood only 1 pinch, it is disqualified, but if the decreased amount stood at 2 pinches, it is fit. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says, if the decreased amount stood at 1 pinch, it is fit. Less than that, it is disqualified. Okay, this is the end of 11a. Stop here for now.